Okay, I thought I would this is a history video. It's also about linguistics. Um, this could be used for homeschooling as a resource. This is also about the origin of the English language, how English came to be, and I believe the information in here will help a lot of people in examining that. I found a lot of key points that often get missed by others. And first off, a quick story. When I was one year, when I was um, doing beekeeping with one of my friends, we went over to look at his bees, and he had invited a coworker. Coworker was from Britain, and I asked him where he was from, and both of them looked at me like I was stupid. I knew he was from Britain, but Britain has about 12 or 13 or 11 different accents. So when you hear an accent, there's like a Cockney accent, there's a London accent, there's the Welsh accent, there's the Cornish accent, there's, people talk differently up in the north in Cumbria and also in York, and of course the Scotch accents. And then you have Shetland accents also, because this island didn't come from just one language, it came from a merging of them, okay? So when you think about the English language, it's actually quite fascinating to think about where it came from and how it came to be. And you have all of those different accent areas in Britain because those used to be different language areas. There's a Kentish accent also. I forgot to mention that one. Now, in our modern era, we tend to think of English as there's modern English, and then 500 years ago would have been Middle English. Before that, going back even way further, several centuries beyond that, then you would have Old English. Okay, Old English became Modern English, which became, or sorry, Old English became Middle English, which became Modern English. And okay, when you're thinking about Old English, this is where there's a couple of mistakes that people make. And it's only been recently that people have been able to start to figure this out, partly because computers have let people reconstruct what Old English used to look like. And part of the problem with that is that there wasn't a lot of literary material to use for that. There is literary material. I'll do a separate video on that. But how English came to be, to analyze that, you have to look at early sources of writing samples and then compare those with languages that are similar to that and that fall in the same language tree. So when you're looking at Old English, people think Old English is one language. What's really fascinating about this is there's actually two periods of vastly different Old English. And that's what I kind of wanted to hit on. The first of these was the Anglo Saxon language. Okay? Anglo Saxon language, which would have included the language of the Jutes and Angles, would have been completely different from the period of English several centuries later. Okay? The reason why they're totally different is because the end of the Anglo-Saxon period came to a close with the invasion of the Great Heathen Army, which was a massive wave of Old Norse speaking people that came into Britain. And both migrations, the Anglo-Saxon migration, when it first came, it spread out through the whole Isle. It really dominated and changed the language of much of the British Isles. The same thing happened with the Old Norse speaking Danes and Norse people that came in, and they settled in what became known as the Danelaw. And that was also their legal system. So you have the Danelaw listed kind of as a territory with its own map, and then you have also the Danelaw as a legal system. Okay, that is a system of laws. So these are not the same language groups. Anglo Saxon language, it looks different in writing from Old Norse. What's very interesting is that Old Norse looks very much like English when you deconstruct the conjugation and look at the root words. Okay, you can find the root words of Old Norse words in English once you start researching what those words are. And many of the words you use throughout the day, there's hundreds, if not thousands of them that have a similar word that's found both in modern English and the Norse speaking languages. Okay, but backing up, first we're going to talk about the Anglo Saxon period. The Anglo Saxon period of England is considered the time period between when the Romans left Britain up until about 650 AD. When the Britons started to withdraw from Britain, um, various German tribes and others began to settle into England. These areas included Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia. They were also kingdoms that rivaled each other. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were not united, not at the first. That only came near the very end. And they were in a power struggle over who was going to dominate and unite the island. I think they kind of had an idea they needed to be on top. And this created, basically, it was, in some ways, it's kind of like a warring states period, although each of them considered themselves a kingdom. So some people call this period, up until the 7th century, that there were 7 principal kingdoms of early Anglo-Saxon England. So there would have been Kent, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, Wessex, Essex, and Sussex. Kent is the area where the Jutes settled. Wessex in Anglo-Saxon language means West Saxon. Essex means East Saxon. Sussex means South Saxon. There's still a lot of words and places in England that have Anglo-Saxon names. That's actually kind of interesting. Now, one of the things that started to happen in the British Isles is that there was a massive Christianity movement that started to occur between the time period of when the Anglo-Saxons started to arrive and the end of the Anglo-Saxon era. St. Patrick arrives in Ireland around 432, and after that, until about 500 AD, the establishment of early Irish churches. Now, I mention that because, backing up, what's very interesting about this period, and that a lot of people failed to notice, is that at the same time there was a Christianity movement in the Anglo-Saxon areas, the same thing was happening in Scotland and Ireland. And it appears that in some ways the fall of the Roman Empire had stirred people up to basically repent and get better and decide to accept Christianity. Not saying that they were very good Christians. I don't know. We just don't have a lot of information. But it's interesting that St. Patrick is from this time period. St. Columba is also from this time period, and so is Augustine. Those are the 3 main missionaries of this era. Augustine had an arrival in England in the late 500s, in which he began to spread Christianity. Christianity also was spread around in Ireland until in the 600s also. And anyway, this continued to shape and occur all throughout the Anglo Saxon period. Now, where it gets interesting is there's an event recorded in 664 AD where there was a church dispute between the Celtic Christian churches and the Roman Christian churches and their practices in England. This is written as the Synod of Whitby 664 AD event. It's kind of hard to find, but what's interesting about this is it shows that there was some form of civilization and government, and because you don't really have Christians if there's total lawlessness and anarchy. So that's I find that quite interesting. Now, another point about this, um, just one second. Okay. One of the key points that I forgot to mention, both about the Anglo Saxon period and the Old Norse period that came into England, is there is this. A few decades ago, there was an idea that came out where people figured out they could figure out what the weather patterns and fertility of a climate and year were like in history by studying tree rings. So they could find really old trees and open them up, and the tree rings would be wider where there was a really fertile and really good growing year or in a good climate. And similarly, the tree rings would be extremely small and narrow during years where there was famine. And they spent a lot of time over many years finding this information and assembling it. And one of the things that happened was they figured out that the period in Europe preceding both the Anglo-Saxon migration and the Viking and Norse migration into England, both of them are marked by famine periods, famine and great darkness that occurred that was kind of a spark that lit the fire for these migrations. Now, the same thing actually was, happening with in the Roman Empire areas were collapsing. And this was an extremely turbulent period. So, you go back to look at it looks like they're in Old Saxony in Europe, where the Anglo Saxons came from, and the coast near Denmark, that there was so much famine that if you don't have food, you don't have civilization, you'd have lawlessness, and it'd be like a warring period. This makes a difference in looking how you look at the Anglo Saxons, and it makes a difference how you look at the Norse and Viking people that came in that settled the Danelaw area, because it's one thing to think that they were, conquerors, but it's another to see that they were also fleeing war themselves and looking for a safe place to settle, because the comparison on that is completely different how you'd view those people. Anyway, this is very fascinating. Both of those groups of people have that. If you are a person that has a belief in God and faith and a belief that there's a purpose to things, you would think that it was as if God was guiding these people to these areas to help us become the kind of people that we became by being their descendants. That's interesting. And it kind of means that maybe God was cherry picking what kind of people he was trying to build for the last days by, taking family lines. If you believe in family and the eternal aspect of the family and the organization of the family, you kind of learn that people have eternal spirits and that they came from God and that they came from a certain place. And this means that family lines are the same as that. Could be that people were being led to areas to where gradually over time their descendants would eventually learn how to accept the gospel. And that's partly why I mentioned the Christianization effort that happened early on. There wouldn't have been a Christianization effort if they weren't good people on some level. They might not have been perfect. So, okay, going back into the history aspect of this. Now, the period between, so breaking things down, after the dispute of the Celtic and Roman Christian churches and their practices, there was the rise of Mercia between 625 and 655. At that point, Mercia was the dominant Anglo Saxon power and kingdom in England. Then I'm going to take a break from this. Just a sec. I'm going to come back later into going more into detail on which kingdoms were which and which were dominant on which period for this. Suffice it to say, the Viking invasions and the Great Heathen Army arrived into England between the periods of 790 up until 878. So what I mean by that is they didn't all arrive at once. At approximately 790 was when the first Vikings started coming in, and at that point it was small raids. They raided Lindisfarne in 793, and they began attacking and raiding other coastal monasteries and settlements. That was the first of the Viking raids. Then that culminated in 865 AD was when the Great Heathen Army arrived. It was called the Great Heathen Army, which was a large coalition of Norse and Danish-speaking warriors. Would have been basically Old Norse-speaking people. They conquered and acquired a very large territory that was mostly the east coast side of the UK. It went pretty far inland, and that became the Danelaw. So the conquest of Northumbria was 866. They captured York and established Norse control over that entire region. Danelaw is considered established in 878. The Danelaw was both a region and a legal system, and it had its own laws and customs. Now, when you study, one of the events in the Bible that you study is the pride cycle. In the pride cycle, as a people start, they usually begin humble and creative and as builders. And then societal rot and corruption enter into society. The people usually become prideful. They're usually warned to, in various ways, to repent or change or try and reform. And as the pride cycle and societal rot begin to grow and manifest, society becomes destructive. When it becomes destructive, people have usually, there's three things that happen. First, captivity increases. The second thing that happens is that people are scattered. They get scattered by war, famine, and other events, as well as the third thing that can happen is they can just, you can be destroyed. Usually, before people are destroyed, they're usually given a chance to change. They could be scattered or put into captivity first, which is much more likely, because that's like a second chance. They're still less likely to change. Now, the reason we're talking about the pride cycle now is that when you learn about what happens in civilizations, these scattering events where people are scattered to go to new areas, this occurs um, when you have this civilizational rot, and when that occurs, for example, when you have war, famine, plagues, and the destruction events, people are scattered and they move. And now, what this means is when these Anglo Saxon people arrive, people in those areas that used to be in those areas were likely to have moved. Okay, they probably wouldn't have stayed if they would have had a choice. It's the same with the Danelaw area and the Norse speaking people. So, inevitably, in the modern era, we call this refugees. Okay, when war happens, people flee the destructive areas, and this is as described as in verses in the Old Testament. In Isaiah, Jeremiah, and the other prophets, they talk about you know how people will be scattered, uh, and then have a chance to repent and rebuild themselves. What this means is it's not likely that people would have stayed in these areas where the conquerors were. This is also why you have Brittonic speaking people in France. So if you look at a map of France, that area on the northwest peninsula where it sticks out into the ocean and is Brittonic speaking. Those people got there because they fled there to escape the Anglo Saxon invasions when the Anglo Saxons arrived into England. And you can still find Brittonic speaking people there. That's kind of interesting, and that's how it got that way. Now, part of why that happened is because before Anglo Saxons were Christianized, they used to practice slavery. That's also a key factor on why people probably wouldn't have stayed. If you know that the conquerors practiced slavery, you would have left. Now, before the Norse speaking people became Christianized, which didn't happen right away, it's probably similar. Um, but eventually, those people, I'm going to talk about the Christianization of Scandinavia and the Norse people on a different video. But suffice it to say, this is kind of how Old English and emerged. That there was a melting pot between people during the first Anglo-Saxon migrations, and then again with the Norse migrations. So when you pull up words in English and look for, you can pull up an AI and ask it the origin of a word. What is the source and origin of this word? You'll find that most of those words have a Norse equivalent. And that's quite fascinating. And it also means that Old Norse, such as was found in Europe, on the continental part of the area of Europe, would have been virtually undistinguishable from Old Norse in England at a certain point. Well, how much so? There probably was some variance. It wouldn't have been a perfect one-to-one translation, likely, but it would have been significantly similar. And this also suggests and shows how and why English is a Germanic language. But before German was recognized as an identity, Norse was. Okay? We tend to think of these, and they're labeled as Germanic languages. But actually, Germany wasn't a country until the 1870s. And the word German came from the Romans describing these people as war bands. German means war band. The first words used were there was a tribe called the Alemanni. That was one of the tribes that the Romans wrote about and documented that were these German speaking invaders, okay, that they'd sometimes clash with. But before Germany became a country, there were many Norse speaking kingdoms already. So it's kind of an irony that we call them German languages instead of calling them Norse speaking languages, right? Interesting. And I'll have more notes on this and how English came to be in later videos. Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe.